Hello. Welcome to Plymouth Profiles Special Edition. Today I'm delighted to let you know that I have two guests with me in studio, the Reverend Stephen Washburn, and also remotely we have Rel Dowdell. Welcome, Steve. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Steve.
And welcome, Rel.
And yes, Rel, sir. Steve, good to be on your show.
Where are you coming from, Rel?
You know, right now, currently, I'm in Hampton, Virginia, which is relatively far from you, but I run the film program at Hampton University, which is a very prestigious HBCU in the Hampton area. So, but I'm originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But I did have the pleasure of visiting your area not long ago, so I was really pleased to get a chance to meet you in person at Reverend Washburn and his esteemed wife's service.
And Steve, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, my parents grew up on Fremont Street in Plymouth, so local roots, and I was raised with the Scrooby covenant of the Pilgrim Separatists, which is as the Lord's free people, we covenant with the Lord to walk in all God's ways known and to be made known whatsoever should cost us, the Lord assisting us. So values of freedom, learning, and keep learning. And it's really the values of that covenant that moved me to be involved in this project, Steve.
And Steve, more recently, you and your wife have been involved here in Plymouth. Tell us how that has happened.
Sure. Mm-hmm. My wife is Reverend Dion Arakawa. She's the first Asian American woman to be ordained to Christian ministry in the United States, and she was engaged to be the transitional pastor at the Church of the Pilgrimage, United Church of Christ, right on Town Square here in Plymouth in November of 2021. So she came here. My forebears went to that church, so it was like a multi-generational homecoming, Steve.
Now, Steve, bringing us to today's special guest, Rel, how is it that you happen to know Rel?
Well, again, guided by the values of the Scrooby Covenant, when I was looking for colleges, I chose Haverford College outside of Philadelphia, a Quaker-founded school, and the value that drew me to Haverford was the address to the graduating class of 1888, Steve, by President Isaac Sharpless, and it goes like this. I suggest, watch out when a Quaker says I suggest, right? I suggest that you preach truth and do righteousness, wherein soever your consciences are called, and see you to it that no other educational, religious, political, or social organization or pet personal ambition cause you to step away from one iota from the values of your moral consciences and your intellectual judgments, for we have not sought to bind them. So again, that value of freedom, learning, and keep learning. So I went to a college outside of New England. I had never lived outside of New England before, but I wanted to meet people whose experience was different from my own. I wanted to go to a college that was small enough so I'd actually have a chance to, get to know people in depth. One of these people was Rel's dad. Following their Quaker values, Haverford College had pioneered something called the post-baccalaureate program. Quaker Dean Cadbury realized that many able students of color in the South had not had a chance to go to institutions of learning with national recognition, like Haverford. So he said, let's organize several of the highly selective northern, predominantly white colleges to bring for a year of free study, a post-baccalaureate year, highly qualified African-American students from the South. And Jim's dad, Rel's dad, Jim, was one of these. And, I went to the college to meet people whose experience was different from my own and learn from them. And I have continued to learn and be a friend of Rel's dad. And when you sing in the choir at Church of the Pilgrimage, Steve, I record often what you sing, and I send it to Rel's dad, Jim, in Atlanta, where he's a retired professor of mathematics at a college in Atlanta.
Terrific. Good. Well, Rel, tell us a little bit about your background.
That's interesting. You know, I really I wasn't really I was always a creative person because of my mother and my father, but I didn't really think about getting into film until I went to graduate school. But before that, I was at Fisk University in Nashville, and I remember a professor was telling me, like, you know, you're writing, you're doing well in this class. It's very descriptive. He said, "Do you like movies?" I was like, "Yeah, my mother. You know, I went to millions of films with my mother growing up, millions of uh, films in the theater." He said, "Well, you should think about going to film school." He said, "Read this article about Spike Lee. He went to NYU, and John Singleton is at USC." And then I was like, "You would think that?" He said, "If you like films as much as you say, and you mention them in your work all the time, you should think about doing that." And I was like, "Wow, you know." I looked into film school. You know, film school is a very expensive endeavor, and it's very competitive. So I applied to the best ones in Boston, USC, in Southern California, and I got into Boston University. I got into USC, and USC is they don't give out much money, but Boston University did give out some money, so I ended up going there and doing very well. But if I had to say what brought me to film, I'd probably say my mom, because when I was little, I saw so many films with my mother that were very diverse. I saw Reds with Warren Beatty when I was like 10. I saw you know, all the Rocky films, Star Wars, and a lot of stuff that was conscious. Terms of Endearment. I remember seeing it with my mother. So it's kind of like when you're little, when you're young, when you're a little kid, and you're in this grandiose theater, and you see this huge screen, the curtains open up. You're kind of like just enamored with the visuals, and you kind of get captivated with it. And you know, it was something that just drove me after a while. I was at Boston University. I was the only black student in the whole program at the time, and I ended up winning the top prize in film with a short film I did called Train Ride with Esther Roll. That's a story with itself. Great black pioneer and actress that was in my film for free at the time, and I just, you know, from there just took off. I was at all the major festivals in the world. I was 21 years old. I was in Berlin. I was at Berlin. I was in Sundance. I was at the Cannes Film Festival. I was a young guy, and I realized that, you know, film is a powerful medium when it's used in a way that could uplift people, which is what Steve and I have done with this current project. But all my films that I've made, whether it be Train Ride about assault on a college campus between young men and young women when drinking is done irresponsibly, Changing the Game, which is about how Wall Street and the streets of an urban city are often the same. It's just some wear suits, some wear urban gear, but the principles are the same as far as, you know, moral corruption oftentimes. And Where's Daddy, which is a documentary that has 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is about how the child support system oftentimes is abused to decimate the African American family. So I think if I had to tell you where my social consciousness came from, my parents and people like Esther Roll and people along my journey who I've met that were elders that gave me the knowledge. Lou Gossett Jr. is a good friend of mine. We talk all the time about things like this as well. So I think that uh, Steve as well, people that have journeyed before me and lend their sage wisdom upon me. I learn from those things, and it galvanizes me to make socially conscious films. And I'm very conscious about deviating from stereotypes about Black people. So many films about African Americans are stereotypical. They demean our race. They demean Black men. They demean Black women. They demean Black children. And I can't take that road to perdition. All my films have to deal with something that uplifts not only African Americans, but others that see those films as well, so everybody can learn from them. If that makes sense, Stephen. Sorry for the long answer.
Rel, that's terrific. And we're taping this in March of 2024. We had hoped to do it last month during Black History Month, but really any month is going to be good to hear about some Black history. But also, we're coming off the heels of the Academy Awards on Sunday. And
Yes.
I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what does it mean when we refer to African American cinema? What is that?
You know, I'm glad you asked because it's changed over the years. You know, way back, that term meant like race movies, because it was like the African American palette back then was people like Oscar Micheaux and Spencer Williams, and they didn't have a lot of money, but they were trying to show the African American experience on silent film back then. Just they could just get anything that shows how we live, and that really, in my opinion, I'm gonna tell you where I think that stemmed from. I believe that all came from that one singular film called Birth of a Nation, which really demeaned and demonized the image of Black men in done by white actors in blackface that were doing virulent things to show that Black men were like animalistic and cannibalistic. It was a horrible film done by D. But at the time, the White House praised that film and showed it in the White House as this seminal piece of work. So I think that film kind of like made a lot of African Americans who had any consciousness to go back and say, we need to show our films made by us in three-dimensional imagery that is not built around savagery, but is built more around integrity and three-dimensional lives with morality and integrity. So that term, African American cinema, has kind of gone from that, and in my opinion, it's kind of deviated, some good, some bad, but it all comes under a template of ethnic cinema. But it started back then with those type of pioneering filmmakers, Spencer Williams, and Oscar Micheaux was number one. To people like Gordon Parks, who made 71, who made a film called The Learning Tree, which is the first African American film that was ever made by a major studio, MGM, at the time in 71. To then you got John Singleton and you had Spike Lee. Then in somewhere there's the blaxploitation era. But see, I really don't count that because a lot of those films were directed by white filmmakers. They had Black people in them. They had black talent in those films, like Richard Roundtree or people like that. But the best films, in my opinion, in that genre were ones done by Black filmmakers, like Michael Schultz did a film called Coolie High, which is outstanding. Oz Davis did a film too, several. So, but that term, I'm glad you mentioned that term, Steve, because it's evolved over the years, in my opinion. Some good, some bad, some progressive, some regressive. But I think now, I saw a film that won an Oscar the day for best adapted screenplay called American Fiction. That film turned out pretty good with Jeffrey Wright in the film. I saw that, written by African American and directed by African American. But that term is interesting. But the Academy Awards you just mentioned, there weren't that many African American winners that I can remember this past Sunday, besides that gentleman. And I think Divine Joy Randolph may have won for her role, and it might have been one other. But the plethora of Academy Awards that are given out, it's kind of hard to gauge Black success because the Academy Awards oftentimes, and this is not a secret to people, oftentimes has not really given kudos and credit to some seminal and very outstanding Black cinematic works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Divine did win Best Supporting Actress in The Holdovers. And preparing for today, I read also that Sidney Poitier was actually an early person that not only acted, but was involved in directing.
He was. And it's interesting that you mentioned him because he was the first person to ever win Best Actor for a great film that he did, Lose of the Field. It's funny you mentioned Sidney Poitier because I often want to mention him along with another pioneer, and that's Harry Belafonte. To me, they're kind of similar because Harry Belafonte and him were both trailblazers in their own way. Because Harry Belafonte actually walked away from Hollywood. He was offered so many roles that he felt were demeaning. He said, "You know what? If I can't produce my own works and get them made by the studio, I'm going to walk away from this and get involved with civil rights." So him and Sidney Poitier actually they had clashed at one point, but they became very good friends to go along their movement of breaking the roles that Blacks were offered in Hollywood. But Sidney Poitier to me he'll always be at the apex because of what he was able to achieve in really an all-white environment at the time in Hollywood. Like I can't think of anybody who was really making the kind of roles that he was in producing the films, like you said, directing the films. I'll give you one interesting thing about Sidney Poitier before you go on. Sidney Poitier was the first African-American filmmaker to ever make a film that grossed $100 million at the box office. And that film was called Stir Crazy with Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor. It was a massive hit. It came out in 1980. But that's the first time a Black filmmaker ever made a film that made $100 million the benchmark of success. If your film is $100 million grossing film, it's a hit. Now imagine this though, Steve. Back in 1980, tickets probably cost what, $2 at the most. Like, I mean, my mother took me to film for $1 sometimes for a matinee. So that $100 million today that film made would probably be about $300-400 million today in today's money. So Sidney Poitier is a benchmark pioneer in many ways for the Black race because he was the first one to win the Best Actor Oscar. He also made a film that broke the barrier for Black filmmaker success, and that's a mainstream film. Stir Crazy is mainstream. Gene Wilder, Richard Pryor, mainstream cast, Joe Beth Williams. So he's definitely a pioneer that was very important. But if you're going to mention him, you got to also mention people like Harry Belafonte as well, if that umbrella of respect makes sense.
Thank you, Rel. And Rel, you mentioned two of your earlier films, and we're going to get to talking about Train Ride and the Moral Corruption and Where's Daddy on the child support system, and then your new release. But before we do that, Steve, I want to come back to you. I know you've known Rel's father in school, and here you are back up in the Plymouth area. What has drawn you to follow Rel in his career?
I would say, the values that my forebears learned here in Plymouth. Plymouth, I mentioned the Scrooby Covenant. Massachusetts was the first state in the United States, going back to colonial times in 1640 to legalize slavery. It was also the first state in the United States in 1783 with Chief Justice William Cushing, Chief Justice Cushing Highway here in the Plymouth area, in response to Quock Walker, a enslaved woman in Western Massachusetts suing for her freedom. She taught herself to read. She read the Massachusetts Constitution, and she said, "This isn't consistent with slavery." And Chief Justice Cushing agreed. Well, it's those values of, everybody counts. And Professor Reed really embodied that and advocated for that. His father was a Baptist pastor, immigrated from Jamaica, served in Western Virginia and then Pennsylvania. And when Reed earned his doctorate at Columbia University, the epigraph he chose to express his approach to anthropology, sociology, and advocacy was a quote from the Jewish philosopher Spinoza. And that quote basically says, not to laugh at the deeds of people, nor to shun or despise them, but simply to understand them. And, as we think about trends today, take the book Bowling Alone. Since around the year 2000, we've become less likely to take part in civic organizations, more isolated, more likely to just take a look at somebody, put a label on them, and judge them and dismiss them and not learn from them. Well, to take that quote from Spinoza and what Ira Reed stood for and what he lived, it's what we need today, to understand each other first and to double check that we really understand each other accurately. And then when I've given you evidence that I understand you, then you're willing to try to understand me in return, and we can learn from each other. So it's the example that Ira Reed lived and advocated. That's what drove me to get involved in this film, again, based on some values here in Plymouth.
Thank you. And just before we get to that film, Rel, I'd like to ask you about a couple of your earlier films in terms of what you were seeking to share with us. First, we'll start with Train Ride, which, as we indicated, was about 3 students in an all-black American college who took advantage of a female students. What were you trying to show with that film?
It's interesting because what's the I guess I could use the word prophetic, but sometimes I work as prophetic. Like, when I was in school, I saw people really just like, I saw a lot of things that disturbed me. And a lot of the things were the disrespect between men and women dating, and how oftentimes the young girls that came in, the freshman girls were the ones that really, the older students kind of, their naivete and alcohol and use of other things could lead to like really destructive situations. So I said, I'm going to make a film about how, this situation could really become one that's explosive on campus and ruin a lot of different lives, the men and the women's. And it's funny because, my films are, someone called me last week this off and they said, "Rel, your film's the precursor to the Me Too movement. You were thinking about this 20 years ago." At the time, I was not thinking about it like that. I just was trying to make what's called in the film term a cautionary tale, something that kind of, if you watch it, it shows you what not to do. That's a cautionary tale. And the film just took off. It was a short film I made in graduate school first. And I was able to get Esther Roll, who's a great actress, pioneering Black actress, Emmy Award winner, to do a cameo in the film as the dean of the school. She played that role for me as the dean of the school. Then when I got financial to make the feature-length version of the film, I called Miss Roll again, and she said, "Rel, I'm glad you got financing for your film. You are my people I love in this world." She says, "But I'm not going to be here much longer. I have diabetes and I'm very ill." She said, "I'm on dialysis." She said, "But I wish you well, and I know your film's going to be important." So I had kind of left Esther all alone. I said, "Well, she's ill. I love Esther. I'm gonna try to find some out." The next day, I got a phone call from her doctor. Her doctor said, "Are you Miss Roll's son?" I said, "No, I'm just." She says, "Well, she thinks a lot of you." I said, "What do you mean?" She says she's now rearranged her dialysis treatment. She's told me, sorry, this is her doctor, her dialysis doctor. She said she's going to fly to Philadelphia from LA against my wishes to be in your film. And I was like, well, and at that time I was so moved. I said, this is my purpose in life. If someone like Esther Roll, who was someone that stood up for Black people on television with Good Times, who's making sure the Black father was on that show when no one else wanted it on the show, and she's going to sacrifice her life to come 3,000 miles with no assistant to be in my film Trainwriter. She knew the importance of that movie. She knew it was a film that had importance because this is someone who's seen the world. She was 70 in her late 70s at the time, and she's in the film, and she passed away a month later. So that film Trainwriter is dedicated. That was Esther Roll's last work. Look up Trainwriter on Wikipedia, anywhere. It says this is Esther Roll's last performance. And it honored me beyond. That's why I think my path is so selective and blessed, because that film Trainwriter is still relevant today. People watch it all the time. I still get calls to screen that film all the time. It's on Tubi. You can watch Trainwriter on Tubi for free. People see it on Tubi and call me on the phone, email me, Facebook me, Instagram me. "I saw your movie last night. I cried. I saw your movie last night. I'm going to show it to my kids. This happened to my daughter." They'll tell me on the phone, "This happened to my daughter. This happened to my son." So, when you have a vision like that about something that can really help young people, you got to make it. A lot of times, parents send their kids off to school and the kids become different people. They change. Whatever their parents taught them, they forget it. And it's the other students that help raise your child at that point. The charismatic, cool students are the ones that end up raising your kids. And they're the ones that they kind of gravitate to. But oftentimes, the cool person is also the most corrupt. So the film that I showed was a young man who was very popular on campus. The girls liked him, but he used those gifts not for good, but to get everybody in a situation that led to a road to perdition. And Esther Roll was in the film. Wood Harris, great actor. It's his first movie. Russell Hornsby, his first film. Great actor. He was in Fences with Denzel Washington. MC Lights in the film. But Steve, in my opinion, it was Esther Roll was the guiding light of that film. She was in my short film version of that movie. She was in the full-length version of that film. And that film was dedicated to her memory. And then the movie says, this film was dedicated to Esther Roll. And I think she's the angel in that film that made that film go so far. Small movie was made for very little money, but it had a great impact on society, even to this day.
She was a great actress, and I certainly enjoyed that show. And I remember when you said the father figure in that show, was that played by John Amos?
Yes.
And so that brings us really to your other movie that I'd like to talk about, Where's Daddy? And actually, I was preparing for this, and one of the women in my office was working on it with me, and she said, you know, I'm so interested in what I'm reading that I want to watch this because it speaks to us insofar as it talks about the child support system and father's rights. And as a practicing attorney, it's something with which we deal all the time. And in fact, in preparing for today, I know that in the National Jurist, your movie was singled out as one of the top 10 inspiring movies to help people identify their legal career. So tell us a little bit about what you were trying to accomplish when you filmed Where's Daddy?
It's funny because that film is how I got linked up with Steve Washburn. Actually, he saw the film, and that's when he had the impetus to say, "I really want you to get involved with the I Read project." But I have a dad. You know, my dad is in my life. Steve's son. Steve is a father of a son who holds him in high regard, and he helped steer. So, but oftentimes the father does not get enough credit, in my opinion. If a dad is trying to be a dad, if he's there, you know, I learned now in my age that just to have a dad is a blessing. Just if you know your dad, if you can call you there on the phone, if he knows who you are, it's a blessing. So, you know, in Philadelphia, if a father owes $600 for child support, they can put him in jail. Like they can come to your house, cuff you, put you in jail. And I was like, damn, what if the father though was trying to be a good dad? What if he's there like emotionally for the child, but he doesn't have any money? Is it fair to put him in jail for that? So it was like I had a myriad of thoughts that went through my mind. I was like, and the black father was the one I thought was getting hit hardest the most with that situation because the money wasn't there, that being jailed, and in my opinion, putting the father in jail for $600 just the wedge between the child and the father even more because the father can't get the money out of jail. Then the mother may be strained the relationship between the mother and the father. The mother may blame the father somehow, and then when the father does eventually get out, that whole relationship is strained. So I just wanted to make a film that broke the stereotype about the black father. Like at the time, I think I was watching like that god awful episodes of the Maury Povich show where they always say, "You are not the father," and the dad is like, "Oh, I'm so glad I'm not the dad." And you see all this fighting and tussling. But I'm gonna tell you an interesting story about Where's Daddy. So when I was trying to make Where's Daddy, I actually called the Maury Povich show to get footage. I said, "Can I show some of the footage of your show of when they say you are not the father and the father is like jumping up and down and being excited about not being the dad and the mother sitting there crying, whatever, and all that diatribe between the two." And a producer called me back. She says, "Mr. Dowdell, we can give you footage, but we have to get clearances from the performers in the scene." So when she said performers, that let me know that those scenes are not real. The Maury Povich show is putting out images of black men and black women that looks like it could have been staged. So I was like, well, they're going to these great lengths to make it look the black father like he's irresponsible and doesn't care about his children, doesn't care about the time with the ex or the spouse or the wife. So I said, I'm going to make a film that shows that black fathers do want to be responsible and loving parents, but they have hindrances in doing so. And oftentimes one small caveat can put that father in jail, which ruins the relationship between the father and the children. And that film did very well. Another film that was made for very little money. Well, I think I had one donor for that film, but now that film was it's in Harvard's library, it's in Yale's library, Princeton's library, it's in like every Ivy League school, Penn, Dartmouth, and almost every school in this country has that film in its library as a credible reference, meaning that there's law schools. Indiana University has that school. Their law school has it. Syracuse University of Law has it. But law schools and other schools that are top echelon are using Where's Daddy to teach children, I mean, their students about law. Like that film is now a legal, credible reference. A film that was made by myself, who's a filmmaker of social consciousness. That film was so thoroughly made that top schools in the world, Harvard has that film in its library. It's an online reference. Yale has it. Princeton has it. Those are schools that hold themselves to the highest caliber of excellence, that use that film to show their students this is how the legal system works against the disenfranchised when it comes to the legal system of child support. So it came from a small idea, Steve. Me watching television, me knowing I have a dad who's concerned about my welfare. Um, Steve, knowing people like Steve Washburn of all races. Good fathers don't get enough credit, but the black father, especially even on film, is so demonized.
Well,
It's so
and what you identified in this movie really, I mean, I see it here even in Plymouth in court, where
yes, sir.
fathers, like in your movie, they have a good job and they lose the job, and then they're either unemployed or have a much less job in terms of income, and yet they don't know enough to go back to court and change the child support order, and it keeps the arrearage keeps building up, and then they get involved in more and more contempts and problems with it. But Steve,
Yes.
it sounds like you watched Where's Daddy, and as we now transition over to his current movie, in watching Where's Daddy, do you see where that would have logically brought Rel to do another movie now on The Professor?
Most definitely. Seeing Where's Daddy showed me how a film can cast a spotlight on an issue and bring a voice of conscience to address that issue. And so meeting Rel, seeing him being honored at Boston University by showing Where's Daddy, and hearing the discussion there. And then, the time when we said, well, we need a filmmaker to do a documentary about Professor Ira Day Augustine Reed. Well, didn't have to think twice, called up Rel and said, say, brother, any interest? And it was immediate.
So Rel, that brings us to your current release. Tell us a little bit about this movie that you've done with Professor Ira Reed.
Steve brought it to me, and I was fascinated because he said, Dr. Ira Reed was this, the first African American professor at Haverford College, which is a very esteemed school. My father, like I said, they met there. It's very well regarded around the country. To receive tenure. Now, tenure is such an esteemed title at a northern elite school, based on the Caucasian foundation. And that means Dr. Reed is someone that really must have went through a lot. Like I look at the, racism and has a lot of different layers. There's microaggressions and there's blatant racism. But I said, well, Dr. Reed must have gone through a lot. And then when Steve told me that he also taught at Atlanta University and was mentored by Dr. Du Bois, and he also was Dr. King's professor when he was at Morehouse University. I said, this gentleman is he's been in the most treasured circles of our culture. Dr. King, Dr. Du Bois, he was someone that did a lot of trailblazing, and he was at Haverford College, which means I love to bring credit to those that I call unsung. So people that you don't know about that did great things, as well as the standard names we hear all the time. But there's also another layer of names that did a lot of work as well. Fannie Lou Hamer, people like that, Ella Baker, Medgar Evers, John Hope Franklin, but Dr. Reed is right in that echelon of people as well who achieved a lot in a very polarizing environment. I look at it like this: had Dr. Reed not done well at Haverford, the door behind him would have closed, and other African Americans could not have come into that elite organization or foundation and get tenure, or they would have came there and they said, well, this person. But the fact that they did so well at Haverford for all those years, he lived a short life, but it was impactful. I said, this film has to be made. So at that point, Steve, the hardest part about making a film is raising money. That's the hardest part for any film. We still raise the money right now to this day. So it's but I told Steve, whatever we raised for the film, we had a lofty goal at first, but we didn't get anywhere near that. So I said, you know what? The film still has to be made. So what we did was we revamped the budget. We did a lot of revamping, revitalizing, but we still got the film made, which is a miracle because oftentimes, money derails projects, but by the grace of God and Steve and his board here, we're on a constant fundraising mission, and still are today, The film got finished. It turned out well. We had a great screening at the Rhode Island Black Film Festival last month. People were in there, crying, clapping, standing up. So the film had a great effect on not just the Black audience, but the white audience, the Asian audience, and it was really powerful to see. But I think Dr. Reed is someone who deserves tremendously this highlight, and I'm glad that Steve thought that this gentleman deserved that recognition. And one more point to that, Steve. Steve had a vision, because now a lot of people that were involved with that film that were on camera have passed away. They knew Dr. Reed, but they were on their last, physically, they were ill. But they said, I want to speak about Dr. Reed and what he meant to my life. I think, Steve, I'm not wrong, it might be 4 or 5 people now that were involved with those testimonies of that film that have passed on since the making of the film. So had we not acted when we did, it's like Esther Roll in my film, Train Ride, that small, minute space to get people on camera to articulate their feelings and get their emotions out, to emote about the importance of Dr. Reed, we would have lost it. Had we shot today to raise money, waiting on money, it would have been a much different film. If that makes sense, Steve. I'm sorry about that.
And Steve, does that comport with your vision of what the film would be?
Absolutely. An example of somebody who was really dedicated to telling us the story of Professor Reed, and who was really at death's door. His name was Hal Roper, and his father, yes. Arthur Raper, was a sociologist at an all-white women's college outside of Atlanta at the same time that Ira Reed was professor at Morehouse and Atlanta University. Well, Reed invited Raper to bring his white students to Atlanta University and Morehouse to tour the campus. And Raper said, of course, we'll have a dialogue. But the parents of those white college students objected. It never happened, and Raper lost his job over it. But Raper and Reed collaborated on a book called Sharecroppers All. It was published in 1941, and it was highly insightful about how the Jim Crow racial segregation system was bad for whites, blacks, bad for everybody except for the people who were dividing in order to conquer and manipulate and get rich. So, when Hal Roper gave his witness about what happened with his father's book and his father losing the job, he was on his deathbed. He died a month later, and he wanted to tell this story because he knew that it was a game changer. And I think this film really calls on each of us in small ways, maybe unsung ways, to be game changers. Talk about being unsung. I have here this teapot. And
that's right.
I'm going to let this teapot sing it because my great-great-grandparents, the Manters on Warren Avenue, had behind the bricks of their kitchen fireplace a hiding place to shelter guests on the Underground Railroad en route to Canada. One of those guests after the Civil War came back and said, I want to give you this teapot to say thank you for sheltering me en route to freedom in Canada. And I kind of felt that we were on the same wavelength. Could I come and work for you? And she came and worked for the Manters on Warren Avenue. The teapot's still in the family. And talk about, the effect then of the unsung person. My grandmother then grew up with this person in her household. She met somebody from England in the early 1900s, and the person from England said, come meet me at this hotel in Boston and have tea with me. So they met out on the sidewalk, and they were walking toward the hotel, and the person in the role of doorman at the hotel was a classmate of hers from Plymouth High School. He was black. He saw them coming. He took off his glove and extended his hand and said, "Well, hello, May." And my grandmother stopped and said, "Well, hello." And the English friend just stalked right by and went into the hotel. So my grandmother eventually caught up with her. And the English friend said, "May, how could you talk to a person like that? That would never happen in England." And my grandmother said, "Well, this is New England." Now, New England isn't perfect, but Plymouth values at their best. The unsung deed, standing up for everybody's humanity. That's what Ira Reid stood for. That's what we want to promote.
And I understand in talking to one of our fellow church members that that's a home on Roaring Ave now occupied by Richard Kent that many people know here in Plymouth. Rel, I understand from when you did a presentation last month here in Plymouth that you were able to do this film with very little material that was, how shall I say, current in the sense of a lack of video or a lack of, something showing him on a live camera. So tell us a little bit about how you're able to weave all that into a film.
That's a good question, because most documentaries do have, or the document or the person is still living, the subject is still living, so they can talk to you face to face. That was the biggest challenge of the film, was to get that done. But thankfully, literally I think it might have been 3 or 4 months ago, and we've been doing this film for over 2 years. But a Haverford employee actually emailed Steve and had this very rare clip of Dr. Reid actually on campus, like speaking to the camera in the first person, in a very genial, warm way that exuded his empathy and his scholarly demeanor. And once we got there, I said, now the film is at its apex, because that's the way that the film ends. And when you see the film, Steve, hopefully you come to our screening next month when we're showing the film at the Rhode Island Black Film Festival again for the second time. You'll see that how that's interwoven into the film. But interestingly enough, when you mentioned about that footage, some of the subjects in the film were so descriptive with their language. It's almost like you can see Dr. Reid speaking through them. And so I know that sounds a little weird, but there's some people in the film that are so descriptive of Dr. Reid and how he changed their lives. It's almost surreal. And in the end of the film, you have Dr. Cornel West, who's a brilliant scholar, world-class scholar, activist. He's in the film for a good amount of time as the anchor, and he speaks about Dr. Reid in ways that blew my mind as the interviewer. He just was spouting off all this stuff about Dr. Reid and how he compared him to all these different people, and then it's heartwarming to see. But that was the major challenge. But we overcame that because the people that spoke were so fluent of their memory. It helped with the visuals I was able to put into the film of Dr. Reid doing different things. But the apex of the coverage was when Steve came back from, I think the young was Patrick Montero was his name, I think, if I'm correct. But he came back and he gave Steve this footage of Dr. Reid live in person. And it's clear. It's not choppy. It's not like, it's very clear. And it really brought the film home. It really did.
So, Steve, last month you brought Rel here to Plymouth to speak on a Sunday, and he had just been recognized for the release of the film on Dr. Ira Reid. Why did you think that the film and the message from Rel was relevant and important for people here in Plymouth to hear?
Because the film really highlights how each of us can count, even when we don't realize it. For example, I heard over these 3.5 years from a myriad of Haverford College alums whose lives were touched by Professor Reed. And when you think about how Reed touched their lives, it also lets us know that each of us does count, and we can make a difference, especially in these times when so much labeling, judging, dismissing, dividing, and attacking is going on. So, for example, I heard from an Italian-American Roman Catholic student who went to Haverford, and there weren't many Italian-American Roman Catholics who were admitted. The college was sort of Protestant and, predominantly. It was changing. And this student said, when I saw Professor Reed surviving on campus, I knew, even though I didn't fit the mold, I could survive on campus too. And I think that example of trusting that each of us is a child of God and everyone we meet is a child of God, and so look for the child of God in the other person as well as in yourself and respect them both. That's what I think this film has to say today. Again, that quote from Spinoza.
And Raul, do you agree with Steve's observations? And what would you say to those who are watching now in terms of the message that you are providing us with this film on Dr. Ira Reed?
Great question, Steve. I think everything Steve said is 100% accurate, on the money, pinpoint. And I think that, oftentimes when other races of people see a film about an African-American person, they say, oh, well, that's only applicable to that demographic. And that's not the case with this film at all. I think that if your mind is open to learning, every film I've made, but this one also especially, it's important, as Steve mentioned earlier, to be open to watching things of other cultures, other races. That's how I lived my whole life. I went to academic schools of a high academic regimen when I was young, Masterman, which is one of the top schools in the country, in Central High School, and Boston University for graduate school. I think the more you're around other people, as well as you got to know yourself, that's important in your culture, but the more you learn from other people and how other people respect each other and deal with each other, it helps you grow as a person. And I think that any race of person, doesn't matter what the race is, they see the Ira Reed documentary, they'll get something from it. And I noticed that, when Steve has put together screenings at his own school, Hartford College, we did a test screening one time. Everybody had to fill out a piece of paper with what they thought about the film. And that was our first cut of the movie, not the way it is now. But everybody put in 10, 10, 10, 9, 9, 10. This film needs to be seen by everybody. And this is pretty much an all-white audience. And I said, well, we have something special here that needs to be cultivated. But if they see the Dr. Reed film, they'll get a lot from it. It's unexpected. It kind of, the way the film moves, it's in a way that it meanders. But it includes all types of people, all races of people, and different ages. We have a student in the film, too. Taylor Johnson, she's at the school right now. But the film not only deals with Dr. Reed, though, I think Steve's also mentioned it, it also deals with the racial problems that Blacks have on white campuses, that are predominantly white campuses. They could happen at Haverford, Penn, Harvard, Yale. But a lot of times the African-American elite student goes to Harvard, goes to Yale, goes to Haverford, goes to Princeton, Dartmouth, USC, and they feel alone. They don't have any support base. And then the racism kind of swallows them up. They feel racism in different ways, whether albeit overt or covert, and it destroys their morale. I think this film also deals with how to deal with racism at an elite Caucasian institution where you don't have a support base. Who do you look to? Dr. Reed, one student we had in the film, Steve Bailey, he said Dr. Reed gave him valuable advice on how to survive at a school like Hartford. He sat him down like he was his son. Son, you better do this. You want to survive at Hartford? You better do this, this, and this if you want to survive in this environment. I think oftentimes that's overlooked. So the film is, even though it's about Dr. Reed, it's also about other things that dealing with racial issues on a campus that is not African American. Am I right, Steve? Am I saying it right, Mr. Washburn?
Amen. And to illustrate, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus' great commandment, as we love God. Well, So how did Dr. Reed show that he loved himself in an appropriate way? When he was called to New York University School of Education to break the color line and become a visiting professor in the early 1940s, news reporter from the New York Times said to him, "Well, now, Professor Reed, you're coming in from the South. What can you bring to us here in New York?" And Professor Reed said, "Well, I'll bring a 6'3" embodiment of the Negro problem right up front." He didn't put the reporter down, and he stood up for what he was going to do. And he gave permission to people to talk about race when it needed to be discussed. And then, in terms of kindness, simple deeds of kindness that any one of us can do. One of the students at Haverford in the class of 1953 got married while he was still a student. He's trying to start a marriage, and he's struggling to be a student. Professor Reed and Professor Reed's wife had them over for a meal at the house, and Mrs. Reed served tomato aspic. Well, when we debuted this film, the Youngs, now 90 years old, paid to have bookmarks with Mrs. Reed's tomato aspic recipe printed on it on the backside of a photo of Professor Reed and distributed at that debut. That simple deed of kindness that any one of us can do to recognize the child of God in our neighbor and to share the child of God in ourselves, that's what this film inspires. That's why we need to do it, show it. And we're looking forward to showing it with no place for hate in Plymouth, possibly for Juneteenth. We'll be seeing about that in the next few months.
Rel,
That's right.
If people watching this want to find out more about you or about your movies, how would they do that?
Well, I'm pretty public, so I'm on Facebook. My name is RELDOWDELL. I'm on Facebook, Instagram. My email is my name, reldowdell@yahoo.com. But I'm not a hard person to find at all. And I teach at Hampton full time as well. I run the film department there, so they can contact me in a variety of ways, and I encourage them to do so. I think that I'm on Twitter as well, so. But I think that, if anyone is moved at all to just not just contact me about the film, but just to talk about, how do we improve racial matters in academia and otherwise, please reach out to me, because like I said, for some reason, even in 2024, race is still a very sensitive topic between people. It keeps people apart when they should be together. And we need films like this one and other ones to create a harmonious discussion between races about how we can work together through vessels like Dr. Reed. And film is a powerful medium when it's used in this type of capacity. But I think that this film gives chance for what's needed most in this country, and that's dialogue, progressive dialogue, not diatribe, dialogue. And I welcome that in any capacity.
Now, Rel, for people that are watching also, we've heard a lot about the fact that you are a professor at a college and that you make movies, but we haven't really heard that much about you. What do you like to do in your spare time? What do you like to do for fun?
You're asking some fine questions now, Steve. It's a good question. Sleep. I like to rest. I can't lie about that. I appreciate family. My mother and father live in Atlanta. I go on there a lot to see, so I like to relax. Nothing too. I don't have like a lot of too many complicated. I'm kind of a simple person outside of the classroom or the editing room. I just like to relax, be around good friends, family. It's funny you mentioned that, Steve, because when you're young, you kind of take family for granted. Like, I'm always going to have my grandmother around, my grandmother, my uncles, my cousins, my aunts. But the older you get, the circle becomes smaller. And after a while, it's like, if I still have my mom and dad around, I better cherish these people, because one day it may not be the same. So the older that I've gotten, the more I've appreciated family and that time with family that you just wouldn't get otherwise. So when my schedule is not so convoluted, I definitely make time to see my parents who are elderly and you know, and just be there and just be let them know that their oldest son has done well. You know, sometimes parents, what keeps them positive is knowing that their children are doing well and that they raised them well, and they're not out here doing things that are hurting people or hurting themselves, but they're bringing light to the community. And I think that that gives my mother a light in her eye when she sees me and says, "My son he did okay." You know, my father said, "You know, my son didn't fall into stereotypes. You know, he did well." I have a little brother as well, so we all close knit. But that's my spare time. You know, I'm just grateful now. A lot of ways, I still have my two parents, and I just do, you know, common things everybody else does. I love movies. I watch movies all the time with friends and family, and you know, it's pretty normal.
Thanks, Rel. And we have
I go to church too, Steve. Too. I go to church too, Steve. Don't forget that. Now I do go to church. I do go to church, brother, all the time. I know that's important.
Same question to you, Steve. We have, as we wind up a couple minutes, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Well, I'm a railroad enthusiast, so I love to take train trips, especially with steam locomotives. I have model trains. Yeah. I enjoy Gilbert and Sullivan at the College Light Opera Company down in Falmouth, Highfields Theater. I enjoy classical music. I enjoy sailing and hiking and nature. You know, I give thanks for good examples. None of us is perfect, but good examples to lead the way. And one of those good examples was Dorothy Richardson, who was the Fisk University Jubilee Singer's daughter, who was music director in the church I grew up in Sharon, Massachusetts. So as I'm driving here in Yon, I sing spirituals and think of Dorothy Richardson. And she helped inspire this project too. So good examples, often from church, but also beyond.
And Rel, one last question for you today.
Yeah, go ahead.
One last question, real simple. What next?
What next? Good question, man. I have some ideas that I really want to start to work on, and I'm gonna jump on those soon. I am. I'm glad you asked that question. That's my next thing, is that when it settles down, definitely want the next thing. But I just want to ask Mr. Washburn one thing before I forget. When is the next screening of the film, and where is it? Do you have that? Do you know the date?
Sunday, April 7th in the afternoon at Rhode Island School of Design as part of the Rhode Island Black Film Festival. And then at Haverford on June 1 for Alumni Weekend. And then hopefully somewhere in the Plymouth area for Juneteenth, but that is to be arranged.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rel Dowdell, professor and part of the African American cinema here in the United States. We thank you for joining us today on Plymouth Profiles. Thank you, Reverend Steve Washburn, in studio here locally. Thank you for bringing Rel to us for not only today, but last month. And this completes today's presentation of Plymouth Profiles. We hope that you've enjoyed it and that you will join us again for future opportunities to profile people from the Plymouth area. I'm Steve Triffletti, and thank you for joining us.